Hi everyone, it's Tracy Purdy with EdTechTeam Online. We're really excited to have you guys join us for our Hangout on air today for visual literacy. We have Dominique in the background today and then on the back channel, so if you guys have questions, you can either tweet them out using the EdTechTeam Online hashtag, or you can put your questions right in the YouTube live feed and she will get back to you or jump in and ask the question. So we're really excited. We have Ken Shelton with us today, and he's going to share his expertise on visual literacy. Ken, before you jump into that, would you mind just introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about you?
Hi, everybody. So I'm Ken Shelton. I am the Global Keynote Specialist and Educational Technology Strategist for EdTechTeam. And I've spent 18 years in the classroom, and of those 18 years, 11 was in a technology lab, and of those 11, the primary focus in the technology lab was on design as well as visual storytelling, hence us doing this session together. So it's definitely an area that I have always had a significant passion towards, and I love when I have the opportunity to share with educators on why visuals are important. As well as how they can transcend any language barriers or any storytelling gaps that students may have, because generally we gravitate more towards visuals than we do anything else. So definitely looking forward to sharing some of my thoughts and hopefully some additional strategies on the use of visuals during this time that we have together.
Awesome, thank you so much. Ken, I was wondering if you could start maybe with telling us what visual literacy is.
So it's kind of a complex explanation, but I will say that number one, when you think about literacy, usually, and I actually mentioned this in my session quite a bit for this, is that we usually associate literacy with the 3 R's, which is reading, writing, and arithmetic. And although that has kind of changed, I would say, with the prevalence of technology and the internet over the last maybe about 15 years, I generally try to add two more to the whole mantra or foundation of literacy. One is information. Because most people, we do Google searches, and, as with the prevalence of information and accessibility, there comes a greater need to be able to appropriately vet information that we look for online. And then the other one is media, because, nowadays, most of us, not all of us, but most of us have access to some sort of media producing mechanism, whether it's a phone, a small camera. I mean, of course, if you think about our phones now, the cameras that I had early on, even in my teens, aren't even close to the capabilities that we have in the palm of our hand now. So with that comes a greater degree of what I would identify as responsibility in regards to media literacy, and that is that what kind of stories can we tell? How do we tell those stories? How do we effectively tell those stories? And then, of course, in most cases, those stories are distributed through various social media channels. So what I think has turned into now, and it's a funny thing I like to share during the session that I'll even share with everyone here, is that, I come from the days of film. So back then, you bought your rolls of film, you put your canister in your camera, you advanced it, and you got your photos. And what happened at that time was I also had my own makeshift darkroom, so I could develop my own prints for the most part. But what happened then was when you, especially if you were on a trip, when you got to that very last canister of film, you tried to make sure that every single exposure counted, because you didn't want to develop it and find out that half the roll was ruined or exposed. But what happens now is that with our phones, we generally get, a whole lot of photos and hope that one will be good, because we can always just delete them. And so what I think that has turned a lot of us into is what I call haphazard storytellers, because we are under the expectation that, oh, if it's no good, I'll just delete it, rather than going through what I would call an observational literate process that can in many cases happen in less than a second to develop an awareness of what story am I trying to tell, who's my intended audience, and then of course what's the best way to tell that story. And then during that mental process, that then can drive the creative process, which in turn the end result are the creative stories that we tell through visual means. So that's why I love this topic, because it is one where we have a lot of people that just get a lot of photos, and then we have a lot of people that have devices, and ideally we can combine those two so that even not just students, but even adults are telling compelling visual stories because they have developed what I would call an observational literacy that is a component of the visual literacy mantra or foundation.
That's interesting, Ken. I hadn't thought about that piece of remembering, like having the film rewind after you're done taking that class. I hadn't thought about that in such a long time. So that was great that you.
And plus, I mean, the other side to it, which then, if you remember that, is, we used to bring our if you didn't develop your prints at home, you brought them to, Target or Thrifty, or I can't remember. Those were the main ones I remember. But and then you had to wait like 3 or 4 days. Whereas now, if you want something printed, it's like instantaneous, and you're waiting, and then you open up and you look and you say, "Oh my God, my pictures are terrible," that kind of thing. So we don't have that. We don't have that degree of chance anymore. But like I said, it's flipped to the other side where it's like, "Oh, I'll just delete it," And ultimately, while I'm thinking about that's where I get into the whole concept of the difference between taking and making of a photo. Taking photos is I get 100 and hopefully one's good, whereas making is a meticulous creative process that instead of me getting 100 and hoping one is good, I take maybe 3 or 4 and know that all 3 or 4 are good.
Awesome. So I think, Ken, you've created a little story that you were going to share with us to just kind of represent visual literacy and how important it is.
Yeah, so going back to your question, I mean, if you think about literacy, literacy to me is a multi-tiered concept that is speaking, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And so, in the context of visuals, the first example that you will pop up is a component of visual literacy that are called visual communications. And one of the things that we generally don't pay attention to because it's part of society in general is signage. So like what you have there is a sign that is actually out my way. And when you think about signage and the literate component of it, what is the purpose of signage? Well, it's visual communications. And in many cases, the signage has to be done and designed in a way that can provide the right degree of information, i.e. communication, that transcends any language barriers. My favorite example to ask folks in the sessions is if they've ever traveled to a country of which they did not speak the language, and then the follow-up question is, how did you navigate, for example, the airport? And of course, it's usually signage, and the signage is usually there are elements to signage that are universally accessible, like, for example, an icon of a male and a female figure with an arrow. 100% of the time, that is usually going to indicate the direction to the restrooms. And so, for example, what you have here is a sign, like I said, that's out my way, that is communicating a particular type of information based upon where you are. And this is what I would deem an example of somewhat ineffective communications, because if you'll notice, if you don't understand English, then you will not be able to read that it says tsunami hazard zone. In case of earthquake, go to high ground or inland. What you would see is you would see that big wave and you see the person trying to go up the hill. But the reason why I identify that as slightly ineffective communication is because if you notice where that person is, they're not on higher ground. So technically they are not safe. Instead of redesigning that sign to where the human figure is up at, let's say, at the top of a mountain, and then you have the wave that only goes to about halfway up the mountain, which would indicate that you're on higher ground, which would in turn communicate that that's where you need to go for safety. So that's one example. Another example out here out my way is, go ahead and click over to the next one, is that sign. Now, what's interesting about this sign, I'm kind of fascinated with signage. In fact, I remember seeing a Pachaka talk by Dan Pink that's on YouTube about signs and how signs are supposed to do several things. One, depending upon where it is, there's, of course, distribute or disseminate information. But the other thing is that in some cases, signs are supposed to help generate empathy, so that you take action without someone telling you what you can and cannot do. But in this case, the thing that I notice about this sign, and I found this to be true of signs in many other countries in the world, is that this is a sign that is essentially a square that is rotated 90 degrees with rounded corners, a yellow background, and essentially a black border. But this sign is kind of flawed in the sense that it has that question mark on there. And usually when you see a sign that has the yellow background with the black border, that indicates some sort of an advisory. And so in this case, it's like, what is being communicated to us, and what is it advising us? And if you've ever been here in California and driven on the freeways between generally Los Angeles County and then down towards San Diego County, you would see this sign sometimes on the freeway, which is supposed to indicate that, you know, people are crossing the freeway, so be aware or be careful. But the big question here is, or the big tell here is the question mark. So if you'll go to reveal where this sign actually is located, and that is there, it's on the bike path. And what I find interesting even about this is that it's communicating to bikers only heading in a north direction, not in a south direction, a north direction. Now, there may be people crossing the bike path. Of course, this would indicate it could be a family, a mother, a father, and a daughter. And of course, the daughter is being dragged because she's not keeping up. But the key here is that it has a question mark. So it's like, we want to warn you about potential pedestrians crossing the bike path, we think. And what's funny is if you'll notice just to the right of that sign, you can barely see it. That actually is the pedestrian path that is adjacent to the bike path. So again, it's when thinking in terms of signage, is what is it communicating? How effective is that communication? And is the sign taking into account, or the design of the sign taking into account any language barriers that if I don't understand, in the case of the tsunami sign, if I don't understand English, is the information being effectively communicated to me to where it will bridge any language barriers I may have? And so then even in terms of visual literacy, that's communications. If you'll go to the image that I shared with you, which is this one here. And so the other layer of visual literacy is the whole concept of storytelling and visual storytelling. And so what you looked at before was visual communications, i.e. distribution of information. Now we're looking at visual communications from a storytelling standpoint. And in many cases, we look at imagery and think, oh, well, that's a cool image, or I see what was happening here. But really, if you want to start looking at a way to build an observational literacy that hopefully can help be the catalyst for being a more effective visual storyteller. And so that's my whole thing here, is that, you know, a lot of times when we think about literacy when it comes to reading and writing, you know, at least for me, the way I was always taught was, you know, one of the ways to get better at writing is to do a lot of reading, and vice versa. And so in the context of visuals, the more we develop an observational literacy of the images that we look at, that can in turn lead to us being more observational about our world, our surroundings, and the environment that we're in, and for us to turn into what I would call good visual storytellers. So for example, taking a look at this image, some of the key question prompts that I would ask in regards to this are, you know, the following, like, what is the setting? You know, what is the location? What is the time of day? Where is it, what the story likely taking place? Who or what is the main character in this story? What are the activities that are going on? Where was the author of this particular image when they made this story? Can you identify any creative choice that they made in the process of creating this story? And then I have a couple of other questions I'm going to share in just a moment. Okay, and so, you know, based upon those impressions, you know, what conclusions can you draw in regards to that particular image? So for example, if you were to title that image, what would the title be? And then in turn, one of my favorite activities that I used to do with students was, okay, now that you've done an analysis of this photo, you've identified the setting, the location, and of course with location, it can be very general, but the setting, the location, the time of day, who the main characters are, what objects are in there, what activities are going on, and what are the supporting details. Now you would theoretically, you have an outline for a fun activity that I used to do with students where they would write a 500 to 750 word story that is associated with this particular image. And so then once you go through all of those processes, then you can go into the next layer of it, which is, you know, asking questions about the artistic choices that the artist made. Why was that image made at that particular instance? Why are we looking at it from, or what is the vantage point of the author? Why are they not closer to the water? Are they standing on the rocks? Are they standing in water? Why did they choose to get an image that looks like it's towards a hill or a mountain versus towards the other direction, which might reveal more of the ocean? And all of those are artistic choices, but all of those can influence the story that's being told. And what's funny is that when I did this image in a workshop that I did, everyone noticed, first of all, they always guess that it is likely at a beach, which it is. And then I also asked the audience in general to And this is where you get into, believe it or not, the information literacy is said, okay, so if it's at a beach, what do we generally associate with the beach? And of course, the most common answer is sand. And I'm like, but do you see sand here? No. Okay, you see what? You see a lot of rocks. Do you notice anything unique about those rocks? What do they look like? Where have you seen rocks that look like that? And what would be your first conclusion as to the location based upon what the rocks look like? So, Tracy, I'll even ask you, you want to guess?
Well, I'm guessing that it's probably the rock's a little bit black, so it could be Hawaii.
That's a good guess, and so I know Dominique is handling the folks online.
Well, maybe
why would you? So then I guess the follow-up question is, why would you guess Hawaii? What about the black rocks leads you to your first guess to be that that's Hawaii?
Well, volcanoes. So the volcanic, yeah.
Exactly. And you see that, even what you just did there is, it's really fun to do that with students, because what it does, and theoretically what you just did and what I'm sharing is the whole concept that was very popular a number of years ago called close reading, where you develop a comprehension based on the information that's provided without necessarily having to bring in any external experiences. And so, yeah, you went through a logical deduction. You looked at the rocks. What is the color of the rocks? What do the rocks look like? I'm guessing Hawaii, because Hawaii obviously is an island, and obviously the islands are formed from volcanoes, and that is, and you are 100% correct, that is volcanic rock. And so what's cool is that, if you look at the activities that are going on also, one of the things that I used to do with students, and I've even done with teachers that have attended the sessions I've done on this, is I've said, okay, so if you're not sure where that is, you go look at the rocks and now look at the activities. Where would you find a location of which there is, where there is not only those kinds of rocks, but if you'll notice the activities that are going on, you see people are snorkeling, there's a paddle boarder there. And what's funny is if you look in the lower right portion of the image, you see someone snorkeling that's down in the water, as opposed to, paddling with their feet up at the surface, right down over where you're circling, exactly. So this is an example of an activity of what I call building an observational literacy. And what I used to do when I was in a classroom is I would do this with the students every day, at the beginning of class, every day for roughly about 6 weeks. And I would give them, the first 4 weeks, I would give them only 1 minute to observe and provide answers to some of the questions I just shared. And what I found is, as the time went by, 1 minute became plenty of time, to where I told the students, the more you do this, ideally you'll be able to do the exact same thing in 10 seconds or less. And then in turn, the faster you're able to do it from an image that is being shared, the next step is to be able to do that exact same thing when you have your phone or your camera with you and you're out and about. Because a lot of times we spend so much time looking down at our devices that we don't look up and to see what's going on in our surroundings and find all the cool stories that can be told, whether it's sitting at a restaurant, sitting at a park, sitting at a beach, any of those types of things. And so there's like I said, there's two components to the process. One, the observational literacy, being able to identify the components of the story that's being told through visual means. And then two, being able to translate that skill set into you being the author of the visual stories that take place as well. So the other side to it is when we go into digital storytelling and then ultimately cinematic narrative. And because we only have a half an hour, and maybe we can do another Hangout on the Air where we can go into details about digital storytelling, and then finally cinematic narrative. But those same things apply because digital storytelling is usually identified as images that move in some capacity. And most people associate the movement of the images as the Ken Burns effect. And so what I share with educators all the time is that ideally, when you are having students produce digital stories, they can develop those stories based on some of the what I've shared even right now, is that it's not a series of images that tell a story. It's each image is essentially one component to a larger story. And so go ahead and go to the graphic that has that process, and I'll just kind of allude to it a little bit. And that would be the process there. Like I said, maybe we can do another Hangout on Air on digital storytelling. But essentially, the key steps in the digital storytelling process are identification of a topic. I'm sorry, that's not it. It's maybe it's a different graphic that I didn't share with you. Go back to the other one, because that's cinematic narrative. but it's okay because it's still similar. So ultimately what happens is when you have students develop digital stories is they have to be able to have a deeper understanding of the images that they are curating for the stories that are being told, and that each individual image would essentially serve as the equivalent of a chapter in the overall story. Cinematic narrative, of course, applies in the same capacity. Cinematic narrative is what we usually refer to as film or video production. And in that capacity, the storytelling visually is still the same, but instead of a singular static image, it's basically a whole bunch of images in a dynamic format. And that's the funny thing that I always share with people when you're using video. Theoretically, video is singular images, but you're just getting 30 of them every second, as opposed to one singular image. And so even when it comes to developing cinematic narrative stories, you know, you look at the key steps. What is the topic that I'm talking about? And incidentally, I do want to add one other thing, is I had a graphic up in my classroom for my students that in the process of looking at visual storytelling, there were three, and really even in design, there were three key questions that you always want to ask yourself. What story am I trying to tell? Who's my intended audience? And what's the best way to tell that story? And so in many cases, the design and creative choices that are made, they should be made based upon answers to those three questions. And so what you're looking at here would be the process for developing a cinematic narrative, where it is identification of a topic, writing of a treatment. And that's where this is the opposite of the writing process in the context that you actually summarize a story before you develop the story. Then writing a script if there is any sort of dialogue. Of course, storyboarding, which is all important, that students don't like to do. But the storyboard provides a visual representation of what you want captured on camera. Production and then evaluation. And then in turn, if you go to the other graphic real quick, when students finally produce their stories, what you want to be aware of, and this is a graphic that I got from a good friend of mine, Frank Gutler, who used to be an instructor for the AFI Screen Ed program. AFI is the American Film Institute. And that is that every time you push the record button and then stop, and then push the record button and stop recording, that constitutes a sentence. And so that's a shot. And then a series of shots is a scene, series of scenes is a sequence, series of sequences is a movie. Because what most students generally will do when they produce a video is they will push the record button and then they'll record their entire project in one shot and then say they're done, which theoretically what they've done is a written equivalent of a run-on sentence. And so you want students to be able to develop an understanding of the whole process in regards to each shot is a sentence. And then just like we do in writing, we want students to provide more depth and perspective in their writing. Well, they need to be able to do the exact same thing when it comes to producing visual stories and, in this case, cinematic narratives. So in many cases, the shot should not be the exact same shot for every scene, every sequence, and for the whole movie. You know, that's why if you look at film and movies, at well-designed and well-directed movies, in many cases, for example, a conversation, to film a conversation, that has to be filmed 5 different times. You film once where you see both, you know, if there's a dialogue between two performers. You film one shot that is your essentially your establishing shot, which has both in it, and you can see the background, so you get a degree of context as to where they are. Then you film one of the speakers speaking, and it's usually from the perspective of the listener. Then you film the same thing from the other speaker from the perspective of the listener. Then you film the perspective of the listener listening to the speaker, and you do the same thing. So that's what I'm saying. Even something as simple as a conversation between two performers, that is filmed a minimum of 5 times. Because you're getting different perspectives and you're providing different visual cues to the overall story. So I know we only had a half an hour, and this is a lot, but hopefully the audience will be able to take some of what we've shared and build upon that. Tracy, I would say if you want, you feel free to share those assets with everybody. Those, as it turns out, those are mine, so they're free to use them. And ideally, we can maybe do some follow-up, because I have like a 15-page PDF that actually, believe it or not, and that's probably why Holly just contacted me, is because I'm actually working on a book right now that'll be titled Digital Literacy, Designing Visual Thinking and Learning, and a lot of what I've shared now and then some will ultimately be in that book. So my goal is to have it completed and ready for print by the first quarter of next year.
That's awesome. Yeah, we would definitely love to dive in with you a little bit deeper on both digital storytelling and cinematic creation in the classroom. This is such a great start. We just started our visual literacy unit on Monday, so yesterday. So people are really just starting to get into this and really understand what it is. Do you have some last, because people sometimes look at this course and they say, visual literacy in the classroom. Why do I need to, as an educator, learn so much about visual literacy? Why is visual literacy so important in the classroom? And can you leave us with just one last thought about that?
So yeah, and I love that question. I'm glad you asked that, because a lot of times in my sessions I get some of the attendees are like, well, I teach math. How does this apply to math? And I'm like, well, I'll tell you two ways. And that's one example, and I'll answer your question even further. Architecture and design. There you go. Architecture is what? It's math, engineering, and visuals. I go, there's a reason why we look at certain buildings and visually we're like, oh my God, that is amazing. Because what's happened is you've had the perfect combination of, like I said, math and theoretically science, and then the visuals that go along with it. It's the whole reason why I have a whole different talk I do on why design matters. And it's one of those things where no matter what class, no matter what your content area is, there has been some sort of visual archive that represents something in that content. History is one of the easiest ones. English is one of the easiest ones. Yes, there are challenges in some others, but like, for example, in science, you know, when I used to work together with the science teachers in my last school, we used to do a whole unit on, like, especially in physics, where I would say, okay, if you're learning about physics, there's all these different concepts of physics: power, friction, acceleration, velocity, all these things. Here's a big one. What does that look like? And so now think about the cognitive process it goes through for a student to say, okay, in order for me to create a visual representation of this, I have to have knowledge and understanding of it, and then now creatively tell the story of what does that mean to me through visual means. Similar concepts can apply in math. I remember having students, of course, the easy one is geometry, but I even remember asking students to be able to identify things like equations in the real world. And I'm like, you know, like, for example, if I'm designing, you know, I did this with my urban design unit. If I'm designing a block, you know, my equation is I have to be able to partition certain amounts of lots that are available for homes. How do I divvy up that space, and how do I create a visual representation of what that space looks like and where the homes can be oriented and designed for maximizing the use of that space? You know, so there are ways to do it that in some cases can be quite complex, but ultimately we live in a visual world, and this is why I think visuals matter.
Yes, they definitely do. So, Ken, thank you so much for taking your time, and we would love to circle back with you to see if we can get another little session with you. And if people have any questions, hopefully you won't mind if they tweet them out to you, or use the EdTechTeam Online hashtag, and we'll send them on to Ken as well. So,
do you guys have my? There's my my Twitter handle, and I have some elements of some of this on my website as well. But like I said, I know it's been. I've done this session at ISTE, I think 4 straight years, and I've been strongly encouraged by a lot of folks to get this in writing, get into a book. So that will be coming out soon as well.
Well, good. We look forward to it. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today for our Hangout on Air. And Ken, thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you. Cheers.